Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon Chapters 17 and 18. Atsuhiro hadn't spent any time working in an office. He was a magician and a thief, and they didn't work in offices. With magic, a lot of it was about sleight of hand, of making one thing look like another, of making things appear normal, when they weren't. So the instant he'd entered the office the Shie Hassaikai were using, he'd felt it. There was something off with the office. It wasn't everything it seemed. There were parts that were normal, but there were parts that felt. There was definitely something hiding here. And that something was probably what they were looking for. The only thing Atsuhiro wasn't sure about was how big it would be. The physical item containing the cure for Himiko would likely be quite small. The storage space, or whatever the Shie Hassaikai had here, was the bit he wasn't sure about. It could just be a small room, it could be a larger hidden space. They hadn't had time to get the building records, and even if they did, he knew they probably didn't have time to measure wall lengths and compare them to what they should be. So they were doing this the old-fashioned way, through intuition and brute force. On that, Atsuhiro had to admit the Nomu were very good with brute force. They were currently overturning everything as they searched, though they had no idea what they were searching for. He'd been tempted, earlier, to tell them to stop. That there was no need to rip apart the office space before he'd realized that there was also no reason not to, and it was possible that moving the desks would reveal something or attract someone's attention. And with them somewhat occupied, it left him free to think about the problem in a logical manner. Magicians would tell you that magic was just magic, but it was also a matter of logic and showmanship. Your audience had to understand what you were doing, even if they didn't know how. So while the Nomu were destroying things, Atsuhiro was carefully looking at the internal walls. Most of the office was open space, but there was one solid internal wall. It paneled, which he thought was interesting. For an office, why would you need to panel it when painting was so much cheaper? He felt a smile form under his mask and quickly moved to the wall. Atsuhiro looked along it. It was straight, and he could see that one end met the external wall, while the other disappeared into a corridor. He made his way down there and looked at the corridor. The signs proclaimed it to be a facilities area. Male and female toilets and changing facilities. They'd take up some space. He looked back at the wall. It didn't quite make sense. A secret door wouldn't come off the internal wall that was open to the rest of the office. That defeated the idea of a secret area. The secret door was far more likely to come off this shorter corridor. Atsuhiro stood at the corner and examined both walls. There was a bit right at the end of the facility corridor that could be it, and there was one point along the internal wall where you could slip away. To separate the walking area from the desks there were some hanging dividers. They could be arranged to obscure the view. He still thought the door would be better in the facility area, but he needed to check that out. Snooping is no good. Atsuhiro whirled at the voice and stared at the man. He had a slight figure with blonde hair covering one eye and was wearing a plague mask that he'd been told the Shie Hassaikai favored. Except for the mask, he looked, well, not like a typical office worker, but like the one who wanted to stand out with a green shirt and a salmon-colored tie. You could just open the door, Atsuhiro replied, touching one hand to his top hat in greeting. And you could leave, he countered, raising one hand. Mr. Compress shook his head and reached into one of his pockets, drawing out several marbles. He held them between his fingers. He always carried a few filled with various useful items. He wasn't expecting them to shoot towards the Shie Hassaikai member. The blonde caught them in one hand and looked at them curiously. Atsuhiro watched as the plague mask tilted back and forth. Not what I was expecting, the man admitted. Usually I get a gun or a knife. How uncouth, he shook his head slightly. The goons used guns. He, Mr. Compress, was not a goon. He was a higher caliber of villain. Atsuhiro watched the Shie Hassaikai member for a bit. He wasn't going to be fooled into attacking just because he didn't appear to be a muscular powerhouse. Those were the more dangerous types generally. They usually had some sort of sneak attack. He watched as the blonde peered at the marbles. As their creator, he could tell what was in each one by how they felt to him. Others took far longer to discern what was inside each one, and sometimes, they couldn't tell. It was usually easy when it was a person, or something with a distinctive shape, but some of these marbles were filled with more genetic items. This is interesting, the man said. Mr. Compress thought about calling the Nomu, but figured he could use the opportunity to gain information. The Nomu could be put to work later. We are at somewhat of an impasse, he agreed. Though you could just give us what we want? Atsuhiro made the suggestion with a chuckle. He already knew the response. I don't think so. The reply was cold. Your little brat has started a war he can't win. Atsuhiro cocked his head slightly at that. The Shie Hassaikai boss was in custody. This facility was under attack, and once it fell, Yakuza thugs tended not to remain loyal to those who had no hold on them. Not that villains were any different, but they didn't pretend to have any relationship past the goal they were working towards. We are different, the Yakuza declared. We will not crumble simply because the boss is absent. He's arrested, Mr. Compress pointed out. Only for now, the Yakuza corrected. You should be thankful, you won't be around to see him freed, he added. Ah, they'd moved on to death threats. So typical. Mr. Compress shook his head again and watched as the Yakuza tossed one of his marbles into the air, playing with it. He was meant to take it as an insult. It was an opportunity. I wouldn't play with them, Atsuhiro warned. Oh? The Yakuza asked, mockingly as he tossed several more marbles into the air. Mr. Compress shook his head slightly and felt the marbles being tossed. They are somewhat dangerous, he said as he released one. Instantly a boulder appeared and gravity took effect. The Yakuza didn't even have time to give a startled cry before it hit him, and as Atsuhiro watched, the man's head was snapped to the side and his body crumpled under the weight of the rock. The noise brought the attention of the Nomu. Mr. Compress raised one hand to indicate he was fine before he took the few steps to the Yakuza. The rock was about 2 meters long, the best part of a meter high, and that again in width. It weighed close to 6 tons. Only those with enhanced strength could even hope to lift it. The Yakuza didn't have enhanced strength. With the way he'd fallen, his head was clear but his body was trapped and he was unconscious. Atsuhiro sighed, and crouched down to retrieve the other marbles that had been stolen earlier. So much for asking him where the door was. He gave the Yakuza a critical look before adding the rock to the marble again. Someone would probably view this scene and there was no need to make interpretation easy. He got up, and looked back at the paneled wall. He'd have to find it the old-fashioned way. While he was reasonably sure the opening wasn't near the external wall, Atsuhiro moved there and walked along the wall, tapping each panel as he went. Tap, 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 tap. There it was. Nomu, he called. The creatures were almost instantly at his side. They moved shockingly fast when required. Break this wall, Mr. Compress instructed, stepping back slightly. He wasn't sure how the Nomu decided which one would break the fall, but one reached out and punched it. The paneling indented. The Nomu hit it again, and this time there was a crack. The Nomu had an odd intelligence scale. Dragon had told them that they wouldn't act independently, but they would obey orders. You could order them to fight, and within the confines of that order they would act independently. But once the fight was over, they had to be given new orders. Since he'd ordered the Nomu to break the wall, Atsuhiro wasn't sure if it would stop now that the wall was broken, but the Nomu didn't. It latched its pointed fingers into the crack and pulled. The paneling ripped away to reveal a deformed door. The Nomu did pause at that. Take that away too, Mr. Compress ordered. The Nomu obeyed, reaching out to rip the door away. It flung it over to the office furniture where it landed with a very loud clatter. The door revealed a long, dark corridor paneled in gray. He couldn't see the end and was about to order the Nomu to go down it when something shimmered a foot or so into the corridor. Mr. Compress stepped back. The Nomu could find out what that was. Hit it, he ordered. The one who had ripped the door away stepped forward again and reached in. Its arm stopped when it reached the shimmer. Whatever it was solid. It was probably someone's quirk, but Mr. Compress couldn't see anyone, so they were most likely at the end of the corridor. The Nomu hit the shimmer a couple of times. The noise produced was odd. The shimmer, whatever it was, didn't resonate, so the main noise was just the sound of flesh on something hard. There wasn't even an echo from the corridor. Well, the Yakuza had blocked that entry, but most people forgot, it didn't matter how strong the door was, if the wall was weak. Mr. Compress stepped back and used his cane to tap the panel next to the corridor. Destroy this, he ordered. One of the dun-colored Nomu hit the wall. While it was paneled, Atsuhiro was expecting the punch to go through plaster and into whatever space was behind the wall. He was not expecting the solid thunk that came from the wall. While the barrier, whatever it was, didn't make a sound, the wall did. It almost rang as if it was steel. Atsuhiro sighed, and looked at the black Nomu. Izuku had said they were the strongest, which was why he only had one black Nomu. They weren't intelligent. He'd seen that earlier, but if it couldn't break the wall, then he'd have to consider another way. The Nomu knew what he wanted and moved to the wall. Mr. Compress saw its muscles bunch before it threw a punch at the wall. The reverberation sounded again. He sighed. For all that the Shie Hassaikai had been disappointing so far, and Atsuhiro was thankful that Dragon wouldn't be allying with them, they were finally showing some intelligence. He was considering what to do when his phone pinged. It was the sound he'd set for a message from Dragon. "How is everyone going?" Mr. Compress sighed and typed his response. "I'm afraid I'm rather pinned down. But I believe I have found the Shie Hassaikai section," he added. He couldn't go anywhere until he found out what was down that corridor. And with the barrier, it was obvious there was something. "On my way," came the reply from Dragon. For a moment Atsuhiro wondered how Izuku knew where he was, but then figured the young man knew what the Nomu felt like and could be guided that way. He didn't have a chance to think of anything further before a hiss from above, followed by a burst of air, and then water distracted him. Atsuhiro sighed, and looked up slightly. He was careful to keep the brim of his hat tilted so that he didn't get a face full of water from the sprinklers. That was not good. He assumed Dabi must have set them off, but it now limited their time with the alarms that would be sent. "Be quick," he messaged to Dragon privately. "I know." The response was quick but was followed by another message to the group. "Everyone head towards Mr. Compress." Atsuhiro nodded. That made sense. If no one else had found anything, then this was the Shie Hassaikai hideout, and centralizing their forces would be the best. And assuming it was only reinforced metal forming the wall, then the warper could get them out easily enough. Dragon was learning. That was good. They could work with that. Yu blinked as he regained consciousness. He knew the difference between waking up and being unconscious, and he had definitely been unconscious. He hurt, which he attributed to why he'd been unconscious, but he was cold. That was unusual. The office was temperature controlled. There was a hissing noise and the drip of water. He focused and saw a mist of water. The office fire sprinklers were on. That was what had woken him up. He took several deep breaths and focused on feeling the water run over his face. He'd lost. That much he knew. The creatures had been stronger than expected and had actually broken through his crystal. He didn't know exactly when he'd fallen unconscious, but it was likely that they pulled back reasonably quickly after that. He felt. He was beyond sore and he thought his arm was broken, but that pain was nothing. It didn't matter. It was temporary. What mattered was that he'd failed. Kai was captured and he hadn't even been able to defend their territory. He'd failed so badly. Yu took another breath and considered just letting the water drown him. Except that was a vain hope. The sprinklers put out a lot of water, but not enough to drown him. And what would drowning accomplish? He was prepared to die for the Shie Hassaikai. He'd been prepared to die to defend here, but he hadn't, and now he was alive, lying on his back, wet and hurting, with no idea what to do. He could get up and go fight again, but that would do nothing. With a broken arm, he wouldn't even be a challenge. And if any of the 8 bullets were having better luck against the creatures, he'd just be a hindrance. Yu wouldn't do that to them. He couldn't. It meant he was a burden. No. He would not be a burden to Kai. The Shie Hassaikai leader had taken him in and given him a new purpose. He would not betray that. The sprinklers hissed and the pipes made some ominous clanging noises before the constant spurt of the water lessened and it dribbled to a halt. The sound changed from that of flowing water to that of dripping water as the desks and chairs dripped. The change was. With the flow of water stopped, he actually felt colder. Yu groaned and sat up, letting the water run down his face. The motion confirmed his left arm was broken, and as best he could, he pulled the limb to him, resting it on his right arm. He couldn't fight like that. Even with crystal eyes, he couldn't effectively compensate. But maybe it wasn't about now. Yu had been around Kai long enough to know that the boss focused on the now, but always had an eye on the future. He knew where the Shie Hassaikai would go. He knew what he was doing. Yu sighed. He didn't want to think about that. Kai had provided that guidance, but the boss wasn't here now. Yu sighed heavily and hunched over. The water dripped off his eyebrows. Kai wasn't here. If the boss had have been there, that brat would never have dared come here. The problem suggested the solution. The brat was here and candor compelled you to admit that the brat would probably win. Whatever those monsters were, they were strong, and while you knew the other 8 bullets were tough, the brat appeared to be ready to spend resources. What an alliance it would have been. But it wasn't going to happen. It would never happen now, and the only way the Shie Hassaikai would survive was if Kai was there to lead them. Yu pushed himself to his feet, stumbling slightly and leaning against a desk before he felt he could stand unaided. Kai wasn't here. Part of the plan with Shin was to defeat this upstart brat, and then go and collect the boss. If they couldn't do one, then they could at least do the other. Kai would be disappointed in their failure, and Yu would accept whatever punishment was due. But so long as Kai was there, the Shie Hassaikai would prevail. Eventually. He couldn't fight now, but he could fight again later, at the boss side, and then the brat would know. Yu shook his head. It was best not to get ahead of himself. For now, he'd leave because he couldn't burden the others with his weakness. Then he'd heal and get the boss. And then there would be a reckoning. Dabi looked around. He hadn't been in many offices. Hospitals. Pharmacies and doctors' surgeries. Yes, he was familiar with all of them and knew exactly how to get in and out to get what he needed with the minimum of fuss, but an office was a new experience. He knew people worked here, but it seemed so routine, so regimented. The desks were arranged in groups of 4, sometimes with a walkway between them, but some formed a pod. There were little touches of the people who worked here. A photo pinned there, a plant here, but it was all he shuddered. He never fooled himself into thinking he could be one of the good guys, but there were times when he was actually glad of that. Now was one of them. The creature's dragon called Nomu was stalking through the space, peering at everything. He didn't know exactly what they were looking for, but Dabi was pretty sure he wasn't going to find it here. Move on, he commanded the Nomu. They didn't even look at him for confirmation, but instead made a beeline for the door. That is, until one of them went flying back through several desks. It was almost pretty with the way paper, who used paper these days, went flying. But Dabi was aware it was indicative of a bigger issue. A laugh came from the far side of the room. It was dark, so he couldn't really see. At last, something to fight. Dabi rolled his eyes at the statement and gestured to the Nomu. They charged and were knocked back again. He frowned. Dragon had explained that there were different types of Nomu. The lowest and weakest had dull-colored skin. The strongest were jet black. Those in between tended to have more vibrant but not natural colors, where natural corresponded to the before quirk skin tones available to humans. Those who had charged were dully colored. That was interesting. The Nomu appeared to know which were the shock troops and were letting them go first. Or maybe he was imagining it. Dabi gestured to one of the more colorful ones. It was green with a purple helmet and had multiple arms. He kind of liked it. It looked dangerous. The Nomu charged and Dabi smirked as he saw chainsaws form on the end of each limb. Let whoever was hiding deal with that. TCH. A quirk? The comment came, but the Nomu didn't immediately fly back. Dabi watched as sparks were generated. Their temporarily bright light let him get a look at the person there. He didn't recognize them, but they were large. He had long hair and wore one of those stupid masks the Shie Hassaikai seemed to favor. What became abundantly clear was that he was fighting with his fists, which were wrapped in leather and reinforced with steel. Dabi couldn't see the guy using a quirk, but all that meant was that his quirk probably wasn't a flashy emitter type 1. Wait. Dabi peered into the gloom. He was using a quirk. The Nomu moved quickly, but the guy was moving even faster. That wasn't possible. Dragon had explained that the Nomu were engineered to be at the pinnacle of human potential. They were then imbued with quirks to make them even stronger. The higher-level Nomu had regeneration and strength and then other quirks. The lower-level Nomu tended to just get the specialist quirks. Dabi wasn't sure if this one had regeneration or extra strength, but the chainsaws on its extra arms were causing the fighter some issues. Dabi could see the way he was being careful to avoid being cut. Though that wasn't stopping him from hitting back. And the way he moved his arms. That wasn't natural. Go for the shoulders, Dabi ordered. That seemed to be the point at which the guy's super movement was centered on. The Nomu made no sign to say it had heard, but it obeyed. It roared and Dabi saw it drive 2 arms towards the guy's shoulders. The guy leapt back, but the Nomu moved with him and there was a splash of blood, but the large guy had moved fast enough to avoid being impaled by the Nomu's arms. Blood stained his white shirt, but that was all. Instead of retreating, the guy laughed again. "This is great." He cheered and then rushed forward again. The Nomu wasn't expecting it, and while it pulled back, Dabi saw the guy catch one of the Nomu's arms and there was a crack as it broke. The guy didn't try to pull the tool out of it, instead he let it drop and then punched another Nomu that was getting close. The Nomu with the broken arm didn't hiss or make any sound to acknowledge the pain. Instead it just lunged forward again. It was kind of fascinating. The Nomu weren't intelligent, but he could see that they didn't have to be. Through the weight of numbers they were effective, and since they didn't stop, they definitely had their uses. And if what Izuku had told him was true, that the doctor could create an intelligent one, his goal might be in reach sooner than he thought. "There you are." The cry startled him. The Nomu was still engaging the big man, but his eyes were firmly fixed on Dabi. He roared and rushed towards him. The Nomu tried to intercept, but the Yakuza was using his quirk again. His arm movements were far too fast and the flailing motion was keeping the Nomu from truly getting in his way. Dabi felt his eyes widen, and for a split second he wasn't in an unknown office, staring at a Yakuza. He was in the dojo, staring at his father as NG rushed at him. He shook his head forcefully. He'd been far too sentimental lately and had to remember his purpose. The memory focused him. And he didn't have time for a fist fight. Dabi extended his hands. "Prominence burn," he murmured, almost bored. Fighters tended to hate emitter quirks, and Dabi wasn't going to give this guy time to recover. Instantly, blue fire wrapped around him, and for a moment it felt warm before Dabi felt it burn him. He didn't care. The fire lanced out, straight into the charging Yakuza. Dabi kept the fire from spearing out, concentrating it on the Yakuza. The beam flared out of existence quickly. Dabi hadn't had much time to generate it, so it was short-lived, but had done enough. The man screamed and actually took a few steps forward before the blue flame ate away at his flesh. Dabi ignored the smell as the man fell to his knees, his screams cut short by the heat of the fire. His body fell to the ground and the fire continued to burn. All over the office little fires were burning. Dabi looked at the corpse disinterestedly. He'd seen enough burnt bodies over the years to know what they looked like. PFTHSSS. Further thought vanished as water splashed down on him, and the body and office as a light rain. The fires still burned. His fire wasn't so cold as to be put out so easily, but it didn't spread. Dabi shook his head and rolled his eyes. Of course, he'd triggered the sprinklers. It was safe to assume an alarm would be going to the fire brigade and the nominated local hero. Fuck. He might have screwed this one up. Shin, I've got him alone. Shin wasn't the only one who jerked at the information. Hekiji did as well and stared at the radio. Then get him, Saramitsu, Shin commanded. They'd been trying to get the brat isolated and it appeared he'd done it for them. Saramitsu would do whatever it took to get him. They all would. Or die trying, because the Shie Hassaikai demanded nothing less, and they would give nothing less than their lives. Izuku made his way through the office. So far the water from the sprinklers hadn't soaked through his clothes, but it was only a matter of time. He could feel water on his legs, but that was because the water was running down and getting into his boots where he'd tucked his leathers into them. And worse, it was trickling down his back where the leathers met the helmet. There would have to be a design change in his costume for the future. The Nomu moved with him. They didn't care that it was wet. He thought the wet carpet would have muffled their footfalls, except every move they made squelched on the carpet. It was kind of slippery and Izuku wished he could spare the energy to make a wind platform. He could do it, but it was better to save his energy for when he needed it. His current getup didn't let him get any natural sunlight on his skin, and while his solar vest was on, it couldn't keep up with what he could do. Plus it was night and it was better to be conservative for now. The noise was annoying and he was blaming that for covering the approach of one of the Shie Hassaikai. The first thing Izuku knew of the attack was a squeal from one of the Nomu. It was so surprising he stopped and almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. A man, with what looked to be a white sack over his head, was biting one of the Nomu. His jaw was opened unnaturally wide and his teeth seemed huge. They weren't pointed. They were normal teeth, but they were far too large for the body. As Izuku watched, the teeth disappeared into the Nomu's flesh and the man pulled back, ripping a huge wound in the side of the Nomu. Izuku expected him to spit the flesh out, but he swallowed. Izuku grimaced. That was kind of gross. Before he could see anything further, the Nomu clustered around him. Izuku recognized it was to protect him, but he needed to see what was going on, except by the time he'd pushed him away, all Izuku could see was a bloody body with blood being washed into the carpet. The sack on his head was torn, revealing a wide-eyed, surprised expression, and his mouth gaped far wider than normal. It revealed that the teeth were as long, straight and strong as Izuku had suspected. Whisper was also there, looking at the body with an expression of faint disgust as she laid a hand on one of the Nomu. He ate them, she said. She didn't appear upset at touching the Nomu, though her hair was plastered to her head, and her long plait didn't so much as drip as deliver a constant stream of water to the floor behind her. Izuku nodded. If anything, Whisper's expression turned more disgusted. That's so nauseating, she muttered. Turning away. Yeah, he agreed, as he scooted around the body. He really didn't want to think what had made the gouges in it, and was suddenly thankful for the water still falling from the sprinklers. It washed the blood from the Nomu, specifically their faces. You saw the message? He asked instead. Whisper nodded. We'd better hurry then, Izuku said, gesturing vaguely to the ceiling. Dabi? Whisper asked to indicate her understanding. I assume so, he told her, but it could have been one of the Shie Hassaikai. His father had been very clear about assumptions and where they lead. Izuku had learned that when he took action on something, he had to be sure. If he wasn't, then all he was doing was allowing himself to be fooled, and the responsible party got away with it. They went up a flight of stairs and came to the floor Mr. Compress was on. It was easy to find him. He was standing near one of the internal walls, and despite the mist of water in the air, they could see the broken section of the wall. It led into darkness. Izuku blinked as he looked at it, activating Nightcat, but all he could see was a smooth corridor. He released the quirk and looked at the wall. Mr. Compress had tried to go around the corridor by having the Nomu rip out the paneling, but the wall behind it was reinforced. As they approached, Mr. Compress dipped his hat to both him and Whisper. Izuku nodded his acknowledgement and then looked again at the corridor. There was a shimmer there. A quirk? He murmured the question. I presume so, Atsuhiro told him. Izuku reached out with Dragon's Horde and he frowned. I can feel something, vaguely, he said, gesturing at the darkened passageway. But not enough to... He shrugged. Not enough to take their quirks? You can take their quirks? Twice asked as he arrived. They are just far enough away that I can't get a grip on them, Izuku explained. Who knew quirks were slippery? Dabi joked as he joined them. There was a hiss from the ceiling and the water stopped. The silence was almost startling until the water began dripping off the desks and tables. Izuku looked at his companions. They can be, Izuku murmured, glaring at the corridor. I can hit the barrier, he suggested. Whisper looked up to the ceiling, as if to confirm the water had stopped before she pulled her long braid over her shoulder and literally wrung it out, letting the excess water fall beside her. Dabi just gave him a grin and started steaming. Since his costume was skin-tight, Twice looked unchanged, and Mr. Compress simply sighed and took off his top hat briefly to shake the water off it. Hopefully his jacket was waterproof. Are you stronger than the Nomu? Whisper asked sensibly. Maybe, Izuku admitted, but as he did that he directed one of the black, higher-tier Nomu to the barrier. They didn't have time to waste. The Nomu obeyed, and slammed into the barrier. It didn't move. Izuku sighed, and gestured at the others. They moved back slightly. He flexed his fingers, forming a fist as he activated a number of quirks. Kilo, hardening and his strength quirks. He slammed his fist into the barrier, feeling a vague sense that time was running out. The impact was solid. If he didn't possess shock absorption, Izuku knew he would have injured himself, but the barrier remained. Darn, he grumbled, before reaching out with radio waves to order the Nomu to attempt to break in through the roof. If the other walls were reinforced, it was probable the ceiling and floor was reinforced. But it was worth a try. He could feel the Shie Hassaikai there. Wait, he could get to them. Maybe. If whatever was at the end of the corridor was only one level, then he could go up or down a floor and get close enough to take their quirks from there. That would bring the barrier down. Did the layout of the lower floors go under here? Izuku asked pointedly as one of the Nomus punched a hole in the ceiling and hauled themselves up. What do you mean? Mr. Compress asked. I can't reach their quirks from here, Izuku explained. But if I can get under them or over them then… He didn't need to conclude. I'm no… Twice never finished the sentence because the lights in the dark corridor leading to the remaining Shie Hassaikai turned on, allowing them to clearly see that the barrier had disappeared. For a moment Izuku just stared, and then he became aware of Twice shaking his head. As if to deny what they all saw. Anyone? He whispered the question. Not us, Mr. Compress replied for them all. So a trap or… Izuku sighed, and commanded the Nomu to enter the now bright space. If it was a trap, then the joke was on them. To defeat them, he only needed to be close enough, and he no longer had time to play. End. The Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon, Chapters 17 and 18. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Join me for the next chapters. Or check out my other works.